All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thank you all so much. Welcome, everybody. My name is Susanna Baruch. I'm the Executive Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. Today's webinar is an introduction to our new project, PULSE, which stands for Psychedelic Use, Law, and Spiritual Experience. This project and today's conversation will be led by Mason Marks, who is Florida Bar Health Law Section Professor at Florida State University College of Law and Senior Fellow and lead of all of our psychedelics work at the Petrie-Flom Center. To let you know a few housekeeping items, you can submit questions at any time using the Q&A feature in the meeting controls at the bottom of your screen. We will have the chat disabled. We will be sharing the fully captioned video with all registrants within a couple of weeks. Please check out the rest of our work. You can use the QR code on the screen, which will take you to our link tree. You can subscribe to our newsletter, check out our blog, Bill of Health, and follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. If you have any technical issues, please feel free to email us during the webinar. petrie-flom@law.harvard.edu, and we will do our best to help. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Professor Marks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Susanna. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending today's event. I'm Mason Marks, and we're going to be discussing with our distinguished guests the new project of the Petrie-Flom Center called PULSE, which convenes legal and religious scholars and practitioners with diverse perspectives to discuss law, policy, and ethics, and how they affect the religious and spiritual use of psychedelics. PULSE-affiliated researchers are exploring a variety of questions, such as how different religious traditions might view psychedelic sacraments, what legal challenges well-established and newer religious traditions might face when integrating psychedelics into their practices, how state and federal regulators should consider psychedelic religious services when drafting rules to regulate psychedelic substances, whether there should be ethical and legal standards for psychedelic church services, as well as how to integrate psychedelic spiritual care into medical practice and end-of-life care. And these are just some of the questions that PULSE-affiliated researchers are analyzing this year. In addition to today's webinar, we have other exciting PULSE programming coming up soon. For instance, on February 14th, Valentine's Day, we'll have a series of in-person panels, midday panels, that put legal and religious scholars in conversation with each other. And this event leads into the Psychedelic Intersections 2025 conference at Harvard Divinity School's Center for the Study of World Religions, which is still accepting paper abstracts for consideration until November 1st. So I encourage you to go to their website, which Victoria just put into the chat, if you'd like to submit a paper abstract or learn more about that event. And we invite you to attend both the PULSE event on February 14th at Harvard Law School and the Divinity School event the following day, Saturday, February 15th. Stay tuned for a formal announcement about the PULSE event. And a good way to stay informed about all Petrie-Flom Center events is to sign up for our newsletter, as well as the newsletter of the Harvard Study of Psychedelics in Society and Culture. PULSE is funded by a grant from Harvard's Mahindra Humanities Center and its Study of Psychedelics in Society and Culture, which is part of a larger cross-campus initiative. We are grateful to the Mahindra Center and the Gracias Family Foundation for making this interdisciplinary programming possible. I also want to thank Tim Ferriss, Matt Mullenweg, and the SciSay Foundation for their support of POPLAR, our other psychedelic legal project at the Petrie-Flom Center, which was founded in 2021. I'm going to now turn it over to our guests, and each of our speakers will speak for up to 8 to 10 minutes. And then after each speaker has had a chance to discuss a topic of interest to them in this area of psychedelic law, we'll have a discussion. And please do put your questions into the Q&A feature of Zoom, and I'll be pulling from that that's sourced throughout the event, and I can pose your questions to the panelists. So without further ado, I will turn things over to our first speaker, Victoria Litman, and I'll ask each speaker to just say a little bit about yourself for our audience. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you, Mason. Hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Litman. I'm very pleased to be part of this exciting webinar to launch the PULSE project. I'm a visiting professor at law at Roger Williams University School of Law, where I teach cannabis, psychedelics, and torts. And I'm also fortunate to be a fellow in psychedelic law and spirituality at the Petrie-Flom Center, so working with the PULSE project as well as POPLAR. So I've been focused on the intersections of psychedelic use, law, and spiritual experience for almost a decade. And that passion motivated my own academic journey through both divinity school and law school, even to a tax law degree. So there is a lot that could fall in within this intersection of these three categories broadly. And we will hear a lot of great perspectives on today's panel and through our PULSE programming this year. What I will be briefly talking about today is the laws that govern a growing movement of people that are organizing themselves into communities that they view as religious and that are using a variety of psychedelic substances as part of ceremony or ritual. These so-called psychedelic churches are diverse. Some appear as spiritually influenced dispensaries, and others look more like what you might imagine when you hear the word church. In addition to psychedelic ceremonies, they hold regular worship services and opportunities for fellowship without any psychoactive substances. Something that I think is especially fascinating about this pathway to psychedelic access is just how drastic the difference is between the state of the law governing the religious use of psychedelics and then the widespread reality of religious communities that use psychedelics in the United States. It's also very interesting that the American legal history of the religious use of psychedelics is intertwined with the legal history of religious freedom in America more broadly. For example, one of the landmark cases in religious freedom jurisprudence is Employment Division, Department of Human Resources v. Smith, and it involved the use of peyote as part of Native American ceremony. The details of the case are beyond the scope of what we'll talk about today, but the decision by the Supreme Court in 1990 radically shifted the test for determining whether a law burdens the free exercise of religion. It was so radical that there was almost unanimous bipartisan support in Congress against it. And that led to the passage of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, also called RFRA, which reinstated a higher standard for laws burdening religious freedom. And in 1997, the Supreme Court held that Congress didn't have the power to pass RFRA as applied to state officials. And so as a result, states have had to pass their own little RFRAs, and only about half of those states have mini RFRAs. So that's a little bit of background on RFRA. In 2006 case, that's often referred to colloquially as the UDV case, due to the name of the community that brought the suit, RFRA was first applied by the Supreme Court in a case involving a psychedelic church whose sacramental ayahuasca was seized by U.S. Customs agents. The court held very narrowly in that case that the federal drug law, the Controlled Substances Act, burdened that specific church's ability to practice its faith, necessitating the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, providing an exemption from the CEA. And apparently, in response to this case, and also from the language of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the DEA promulgated interim guidance for parties that want to petition for a religious exemption from the CEA. Excuse me, the CSA. This DEA exemption process defines the legal reality for psychedelic churches today, but it is not practical. It requires that churches essentially demonstrate their religious sincerity, disclose their illegal activity, and they have no guarantee of protection. The DEA has also not yet been willing to voluntarily give any religious exemptions from the Controlled Substances Act. Since the UDV decision, two other churches have been able to get DEA exemptions through litigation and settlement. But generally, the DEA has failed to answer most applications for exemption and failed to grant any exemptions, even in situations where they have done site visits or otherwise been in communication with communities. It is to the point where most lawyers who advise psychedelic churches do not advise them to apply for a DEA exemption. The result of this lack of cooperation by the DEA is that there are very few psychedelic churches that operate in complete compliance with federal law. But as I mentioned, nationwide, many people are forming communities with the aim of exercising sincerely or maybe insincerely, who gets to decide, held beliefs related to the use of psychedelics to connect with the divine. Thinking about these topics challenges us to ask questions about what a religion is, and as I said, who should get to decide, especially when the decision has legal implications. Meanwhile, it is also worthwhile to consider that for the time being, many people are accessing psychedelics through religious communities, and perhaps even more so than any other legal or quasi-legal pathway, such as through FDA trials or state-regulated psychedelic access. In my work, including publications in the Cato Institute's Regulation magazine and the Ohio State Journal of Criminal Law, I've tried to meet the situation as it is. I've asked questions like, how can we make this existing religious use safer? How can we make it easier for churches to comply with the law? How can we protect people that are seeking access to psychedelics from bad actors? I've also considered how the law might be different. Can we change who in the federal government is evaluating sincerity? Are the courts or is the DEA in the best position to make this call? Should we treat churches who use psychedelics differently than we treat other churches? One big area that I've focused on is the issue of tax-exempt status for psychedelic churches. Recent litigation decided in the DC Circuit Court highlights the challenge that churches face. IRS requires that tax-exempt organizations serve charitable purposes. The IRS has said that if it's an illegal purpose, it's not charitable. Because of this, the IRS denied tax-exempt status to a church called the Ayahuasca Church, like the state Iowa, claiming their sacramental use of ayahuasca was illegal since they did not have one of these DEA exemptions that would make it legal. Both the district court and appeals court found for the IRS. Without getting too into the details, one of the main sentiments is that the church sued the wrong agency. Although there are interesting counter-arguments, such as that each agency is supposed to apply RFRA independently, the fact that IRS could say that even if they granted tax-exempt status, this would not make the illegal activity legal, was extremely persuasive. Essentially, the courts say that there is no connection between an IRS designation of tax-exempt status and a judgment of the safety and sincerity and legality of sacramental use of psychedelics. The last thing I'll say is that while the courts have said that there is no connection between tax-exempt status and a DEA exemption, it is my view that there should be. 501c3 determination, while not required, is one of the only ways that a religious community can have their church status officially recognized by the government. We actually have IRS church factors, and the IRS is the only federal agency that is currently actively and regularly evaluating whether an organization is considered a church in the eyes of the law. So I've argued that an IRS exemption and a DEA exemption should be linked, as that would remove the DEA, a law enforcement agency, from being in the position of deciding religious sincerity, which it seems like it doesn't really want to be doing anyways, since, again, it has failed to voluntarily give any of these exemptions. Taking my proposal one step further, I've also suggested that we could even do the same thing with DEA exemptions as we do with IRS exemptions, in the sense of just presuming that churches are automatically exempt and then subjecting them to certain requirements and regulations. That is what we do with with regular churches. They are presumed to be tax exempt. And then the IRS is still able to go after these churches if they think they're committing fraud or otherwise failing to comply with tax law. But what this would do is this would shift the whole landscape of these psychedelic communities into a presumptively legal and safer reality. So I don't think psychedelic religious practice is inherently harmful, but we know that harm can occur. If we can shift this legal landscape into a place where there's presumed legality, then this would allow individuals who are harmed or injured to seek emergency services and legal recourse because they would not be doing activity that is presumed illegal. But these are just my proposals for now. They're just dreams. They're not actual yet. The federal government's perspective is that if you do not have a DEA exemption, your activity is illegal. The DEA is still not granting exemptions and has not done any formal rulemaking on the process. As I've said, because of this, there is really no clear pathway to legal protection for churches. But I do think that as a result of this area is fertile with possibilities for policy change through every avenue, including litigation and legislation. So I'm really looking forward to continuing to develop my existing proposals and explore other possible pathways to law reform this coming year as part of my role as a fellow in psychedelic law and spirituality at the Petrie-Flom Center, and specifically with the Pulse Project. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And we'll turn next to our next speaker, Swayam Bugaria. Welcome.
Thank you, Mason, for this invitation. I am really grateful to be here. I'm an assistant professor of Hindu studies at the Harvard Divinity School. My main work is predominantly on the relation between psychiatry and spirituality in India. And in that work, I have sort of worked with creating cross-cultural assessments for psychological experience related to common mental health disorders, mostly depression. Having done that work, I realized how even a simple task as creating cross-cultural assessments for depression is difficult. So you can imagine that psychedelics, with its assessments about mystical state and awe and all the states of consciousness, is even more difficult to do. So what I thought I would do today is to speak in my capacity as an anthropologist more generically and try to approach this conversation on psychedelics from a more global perspective. I think that it is not a secret that even when we speak about non-weird contexts of psychedelic use, the anthropological data still comes from a very select number of indigenous communities. Most of the world is still absent from discussion or present only as one more geographical instantiation in which documentation of an analogous experience can be found. Now, here is the twist, at least in my head. It might also be the case that there is a lot of global variance in the amount of salience that is actually put on these kinds of experiences as it is described in the literature on psychedelics. I think that in the field's proclivity to try and amass cross-cultural prototypes for the subjective experience of psychedelics, we miss considering the basic point that an altered or mystical or non-ordinary state of consciousness, as they are described, might just not have that kind of cultural traction in other places in the world. To account for this uneven landscape, I think we need to do a better job to aggregate our or we need to find a better way to aggregate our understanding of the variety of psychedelic-like experiences in the world than merely cross-cultural cherry picking. And I want to basically just make three related points to this larger theme. So first, what do I mean that access to a certain type of experience might just be absent in a particular region? I don't only mean that you can't find instantiations of such an experience there. Rather, what I mean is that the feature of the experience we might be looking for, let's say connectedness to nature, might just not be available as a directly perceivable phenomena that can be reported as part of a self-report. It might just be present in a way that does not lend itself to being easily reflected in the psychometric instruments. Now, being able to do this is the premise for a lot of the psychometric instruments related to acute subjective effects to work. In some ways, to use a term from a philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, misplaced concreteness is baked into the design of these questionnaires. But I do think that the four factors of the MEQ or the connectedness factor in the awe experience scale or what have you are not concepts for which one can find one-to-one referential descriptions. Methods like response evaluation techniques, which anthropologists also do quite regularly, might only add a little more conviction. But I think we need to treat these factors as higher order concepts, which are a little bit more difficult to operationalize as psychometric constructs than most other analogous seeming ideas. The second point that I wanted to briefly mention is that, and I think this is related, the epistemological implication of a psychedelic experience is unclear. Is it the case that for a large number of people, these spiritual experiences cannot be attained by any other means? A lot of users will say yes. Does that mean that we can analogize or that we don't analogize this experience to other psychological or cognitive experiences that we have, such as awe, or is there something unique? I think the psychometric questionnaires that we often rely on for measurement don't give a clear answer. Sometimes they might analogize what is happening in a psychedelic experience as awe, and sometimes you might have a factor like ineffability, which might be unique for the class of psychedelic experiences. I think we need to think about this epistemic question carefully. This is not just a matter of cognitive liberty, but also about what is the larger permissible and probable space of experiences within which a psychedelic experience is relativized as having or not having some resemblance to other kinds of experience. This is, of course, very important for legal acceptance, but I also think important for the larger question of how these substances will be enculturated. And this brings me to my third and final point, which is what can the field do about this? And I think my suggestion might seem counterintuitive. The field might help with a big bath of conceptual hygiene. I think there is a conversation that is already happening. In an important article that came out a month ago, researchers at Johns Hopkins have noted that a lot of the instruments suffer from validity limitations, baggage from older psychological paradigms, etc. Maybe the proliferation of the different questionnaires is a symptom in which the field has perhaps become too maximalist in their approach to the question of subjective experience. In my head, I think the problem is that the field might be doing too many steps or taking too many steps at the same time. Rather than treating acute subjective effects as one big mystery, perhaps it might be better to think of approaching this as a series of small mysteries that have to be answered sequentially. Before maximalism, maybe we need minimalism. My own inspiration for this point comes from the field of consciousness studies and the philosopher of mind, Thomas Metzinger's recent book, in which he advocates for what he calls the minimal phenomenal experience. Maybe we need a minimal spiritual experience as a first step in this larger ground clearing. This might require isolating one or two of the several constructs that are measured in these instruments and then progressively building towards a sufficiently maximal picture from there. The construct does not have to have a definitional structure. I think it can be probabilistic, but I think something like a critical mass of conviction on step one needs to be established before going on to step two. Fourth point, I don't have a fourth point, but I thought that I would just mention the fourth point because the Natural Psychedelic Substance Act is question number 4 on the Massachusetts ballot. And I thought that was a weird coincidence, but that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I definitely want to return to these ideas in the discussion. That was great. And we will turn next to Jamie Clark-Souls. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you, Mason, for the wonderful invitation to participate in the webinar and the Pulse program itself. I am Jamie Clark-Souls. I am professor of New Testament at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University in Dallas and the founding director of the Baptist House of Studies here at Perkins. So we all know that psychedelics have long been used for medical and spiritual purposes across cultures. At present, psychedelic-assisted therapy is being studied and deployed for a stunning array of medical conditions. In an important paper from the Emory Center for Psychedelics and Spirituality that came out last year, along with other literature, right? The literature copiously documents and here I quote from the Emory Center paper, consistent presence of CERT, that is spiritual, existential, religious, and theological, experiences in psychedelic-assisted therapy, often focusing specifically on mystical type experiences. Especially striking is the importance ascribed to CERT experiences as potential mediators of healing with respect to mental health disorders rather than a mere byproduct. Meanwhile, the Christian church, broadly construed, is arguably largely unaware of or uninvolved with the so-called psychedelic renaissance. It is ignorant of the medical therapeutic trajectory, which is regularly presented in mainstream news media, and even more so regarding movements in the larger culture involving access to and use of psychedelics beyond medical contexts. In order to fill this gap, I am currently under contract to write a book tentatively titled Psychedelics and Soul Care: What Christians Need to Know. Reduced to one sentence, the primary purpose of the project is to help the church participate intelligently, skillfully, ethically, and meaningfully with the way psychedelics and the Christian tradition connect or not, so that the church can better serve those seeking healing and spiritual growth. So to me, there are at least 4 areas that the church needs to address. First, it must understand the medical therapeutic context. As noted above, psychedelics are bringing deep healing to people suffering from a variety of ailments. How does the church engage this fact, and what is its responsibility in terms of, for example, pastoral care considerations and denominational policies? Second, while psychedelics remain largely illegal in the United States, their legal status is currently under review in many states and has already changed in some. As they become decriminalized and legal, more people will have access. Thus, the church needs to consider those Christians who will seek to experience psychedelics in individual or group settings for purposes of spiritual formation. The Christian Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, narrates mystical experiences and even various induction techniques to invite them. Thus, when contemporary Christians have psychedelic mystical experiences, whether in the context of medical treatment or intentional spiritual formation practices, they stand in a long line of religious ancestors who have traveled this terrain. So my argument will focus not on whether ancient Christians ingested psychedelics, some other scholars do that, but rather upon the ways that the non-ordinary experiences in the Bible might be generative for those preparing for or integrating psychedelic sessions. Christianity provides one time-tested container for meaning making. Third, there are many justice issues to be addressed. This includes right relationship with the earth from which these plant medicines come, as well as right relationships with Indigenous and First Nations or Native American people who have a much longer history with these medicines, especially in sacred communal settings. There are accessibility issues, especially with respect to BIPOC. Often those suffering the most from societal and political oppression and generational trauma are those least afforded legal access, but most harshly punished if caught accessing these medicines in other ways. Fourth, as these medicines become more widely accessed, it is imperative that the church participate in harm reduction efforts. These are powerful substances, and abundant caution is in order. The church needs to be equipped to advise those considering a psychedelic session and those who have already had the experience. In sum, I will argue that the church is called to serve those in clinical contexts, those outside the church, those in the church who have already had psychedelic experiences, and those considering it. In order to serve people, the church must first become educated and reflect carefully on the topic, rather than rely on mere impressions, anecdotal evidence, or outdated information. So you may have the question as to why me for this project. So I'm happy to go into more detail, but here are a few experiences or roles that I serve in that I'm bringing to the project. So first, I was a study participant for religious leaders in an FDA trial, and therefore, as a result, I am deeply familiar with the terrain involved in the sessions, and because it was legal, I am in a position to speak publicly about it where relevant. Second, I'm also an ordained Baptist minister and a seminary professor whose job entails attention to the academic, professional, and spiritual formation of students and those to whom they will minister upon graduation, whether as clergy, chaplains, or lay leaders. Third, as I said, I'm a New Testament scholar whose current research includes, in part, the intersection of psychedelics and Christianity with special attention to sacred texts. In fact, I recently published an article in the spring called Psychedelics, the Bible, and the Divine in the journal called Religions, and I just dropped it in the chat. Fourth, I serve on the Transforming Chaplaincy Psychedelic Chaplaincy Network, which is working to establish accreditation standards, ethical codes of conduct, and systems of accountability for those who want to specialize in psychedelic chaplaincy. So a specialized track, a lot like palliative care. Fifth, I'm a field scholar for the Emory Center for Psychedelics and Spirituality at Emory Med School, which fully integrates clinical psychiatry and spiritual health. I also recently completed this certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies and research through CIIS, and I'm serving as a small group mentor for that program. Finally, I spend a lot of my time these days speaking to a wide variety, speaking and listening, I should add, to a wide variety of audiences in very different contexts, from specifically Christian to interfaith to secular to medical to academic. I can say more about that. A few things I would highlight just in the past 15 months or so. I spoke at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago on a panel with Father Richard Rohr and Dr. Elaine Pagels, the American Academy of Religion, the Cleveland Clinic, and so on. So I'm very excited to be part of this project, to learn from other people as I undertake my current book project. And yeah, just excited to be part of this. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And that seems like such an important issue, the psychedelic literacy of the church. So maybe we can come back to that in our discussion. And next we'll turn to Vin Sony. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for including me in this really important conversation. I'm Vin Sony. I'm the Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life at the University of Southern California, where I also teach in the Marshall School of Business, the Dornsife College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the Chan Division of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy. I'm really grateful to be part of this group and to be part of this conversation around psychedelic spirituality and the law. It's sort of the convergence of many of my personal and professional interests. What I thought I'd do today is, I'm not an expert at anything or a researcher or an academic, but I have a story to tell that might be helpful in framing some of the questions that I've had, and some of the things that I hope to learn from the group and from others in this process. So as I said, I'm the Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life here at USC. That means I'm basically the university chaplain. I oversee more religious groups, almost 90 student religious groups, and more campus chaplains, almost 50 campus chaplains, than anyone in the United States. And according to Harvard Divinity School, I do so in the heart of Los Angeles, the most religiously diverse city in human history. When I got the job in 2008, I think I was an unusual candidate to be in this role. I'm the first Hindu in American history to be the chief religious leader of a university. Everyone else in the country who had this job was a ordained Protestant minister, was a non-ordained Hindu attorney, but it was 2008. There was a lot of hope and change in the air. I was sort of the beneficiary of what was going on in the culture. But when I got the job, I really thought it was my dream job. And that's because I got to walk alongside students and their spiritual journeys in the way that I also walked alongside my university chaplain as an undergraduate. And students would come to me, even though in 2008, when I started, students had seen their parents' sort of net worth decrease by half with the economic crisis. They were still filled with hope and the aspiration to be the change they wanted to see in the world. And my conversations with students were very similar to my conversations with my chaplain as a college student. We talked about meaning and purpose and hopes and dreams. But about 5 or 6 years later, those conversations had dramatically changed. As millennials left campus and post-millennials sort of entered campus, my conversations went from how should I live to why should I live? And instead of talking about meaning, we were talking about meaninglessness. Instead of talking about hope, we were talking about hopelessness. Instead of feeling like they were living their dreams, students started to feel like they were living their nightmares. And at that time, I began to see what I thought was a mental health crisis in American higher education. And the data suggests that that's true. I mean, 65, 35, 10 are the numbers that keep me up. 65% of our students are so anxious that they have trouble functioning across higher education. 35% are wrestling with a mental health challenge like depression, and 10% have had thoughts of suicide over the last year. 5% have a plan. Those are the numbers that keep me up. And as I grew into my role at USC, I inherited other roles in crisis, in wellness, in threat assessment. And so I was carrying multiple roles that allowed me to see a generational crisis from a 40,000-foot point of view. And in my work in trying to support students, things got really bad. I've probably overseen more student memorial services than anyone in the United States over the last 10 years. I've had dozens of students who have died by suicide or accidental drug overdoses over the last 10 years. I've spent a lot of time with their parents and their families. Those students live with me. They live in my heart, in my mind. I carry them with me wherever I go. And so I take what's happening on my college campus very personally, very seriously. and I would do anything I can to support my students. And so I started to build all these different wellness programs and modalities. I tried to think upstream about how to address the crisis as opposed to downstream. I did things that I would have sort of been aghast that I did as a scholar, like build mindfulness and yoga programs, which as a scholar I'm very critical of, sort of a kind of form of neo-spiritual colonialism in a corporate setting. But as the Dean of Religious Life, I will do anything that my students say are helpful. What I now think is that we are not in the, this is my point of view, we're not in the middle of a mental health crisis of anxiety, depression, and suicidality. I do feel, though, young people are in the middle of a spiritual health crisis of meaning-making human connection and loneliness that manifests as a mental health crisis of suicidality, anxiety, and depression. And I take that from Lisa Miller's work from Columbia University, who says that if you have an intergenerational religious or spiritual experience growing up, if you go to temple or masjid or gurdwara or do other things with parents or grandparents that are meaning making and community building and sort of predicated on an ethical framework, then you are 80% less likely to experience depression as a young adult. And so correlation isn't always exactly causality, but in this case, I think it is. When we have 51% of our college students at USC who are not affiliated with a religion compared to 5% of their grandparents, and we have record high levels of anxiety, depression, suicidality, I see, I think, in action what Lisa has seen in research. And so, you know, when I think about my own college experience, I think about what protective factors did we have? We had strong relationships. We had the liberal arts. We had religious and spiritual practice. But I also grew up at a time before, you know, the internet, where many people who were my age and my friend groups had very powerful psychedelic experiences at a pretty young age, in college especially, but even beforehand, that felt like they were transformational, not recreational. That when we were coming of age, our psychedelic experiences weren't for fun. They were to transform our mind. We were studying indigenous traditions, shamanic traditions. We thought about psychedelic experiences across, you know, religious histories and perspectives. And so I really feel like for my generation, for the community that I was with, navigating very difficult, challenging questions and issues as young adults, psychedelics were a lifeline for us, quite frankly. And for many of us, they gave us a language of the sacred. They gave us a language of the religious. They made us feel like we were part of a larger whole. They brought us into a community of care. They did the things that religion has historically done. And they reminded us of the Good Friday experiment at Harvard, which many of you know about, the famous Timothy Leary experiment in 1962 at the Marshall Chapel. Sorry, it was at Boston University, at the Marsh Chapel at Boston University. Where virtually everyone, there was a control group, and then there were people who I think were taking psilocybin, and virtually everyone who took psilocybin had a profound religious experience. I don't know if we can pull up a slide that I stole from Paul Stamets that I find really funny in this particular case. So this is the case, the challenge of running a placebo group on a psychedelic research project. But I imagine this is similar to what the Marsh Chapel looked like in 1962. And so, but what I found interesting is that it wasn't a coincidence that this research project was happening in a religious life context in higher education, because many people who do the work I do, who are deans of religious life or university chaplains, do that work because they had a psychedelic experience at some point in their life. They can draw a straight line from that experience to the work of chaplaincy. Now what I've seen is students are coming back to psychedelics because it's been mainstream. I think Michael Pollan has a lot to do with this, but it's in the zeitgeist. Now when students come to me and they're really struggling with depression or substance abuse issues, they used to say, I'm thinking about inpatient care or AA or other kinds of therapy. Now they're saying, I'm thinking about inpatient care, AA, other forms of therapy, or an ayahuasca retreat in Peru. So it's just sort of on the table. It's part of their menu of thinking about things. The university chaplain at Pepperdine, which is a fairly, conservative Christian school, it's a dry campus. I think they're affiliated with maybe Disciples. Anyway, she tells me now her students basically go to mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, for religious and spiritual experience as part of their religious practice. It's something new that she's seen on her campus that she had never seen on her campus before. And virtually every party I go to in Los Angeles now, whether it's a hedge fund person, whether it's a tech person, whether it's an entertainment executive, whether it's a nonprofit leader, everyone at the party is basically microdosing psilocybin. It's just become the mainstream sort of zeitgeist thing. And so I guess what I'm thinking about now is the macro question. Where are we heading and how can universities play a part? I think where we're heading is a psychedelic assisted therapy industry where universities can help train the next generation of psychedelic assisted therapists or marital therapists who are using MDMA or 5-MAPB in their practices. To me, that's where I think students want to go, young people want to go. I think that's where the culture is going. And one of the ways to do that is to develop professional programs in psychedelic therapy and chaplaincy and marital therapy, marriage and family programs, et cetera. And I also think where we're going is hopefully in doing research on the healing properties or possibilities of psychedelic medicine at research universities. We're trying to do that at USC, our first psychedelic research project we're trying to launch that's trying to measure the impact of psilocybin combined with mindfulness for post-chemotherapy recovery, run out of our Norris Cancer Center. But we all know the challenges of the law. We all know that the legal framework is the thing that is prohibiting us from doing a lot. Victoria beautifully summarized the sort of Supreme Court trajectory from employment division to RFRA to UDV. But even that doesn't provide us a therapeutic framework because psychedelics are still Schedule I drugs along with heroin, which means, according to the federal government, they have no medical or properties or possibilities. We saw what a sort of schizophrenic patchwork job was done with a cannabis framework in terms of research and legality and therapy. And so I'm trying to think about what we can learn from there. And I'm following very closely my friend Vin Sony, who gave $3 million to his alma mater, the Yale University, to establish the Sony Chair in Psychiatry and Psychedelics. He did so because people in our friend group who have severe and significant PTSD were really transformed with their ayahuasca experiences. And we saw this firsthand, even after 10 years of sort of intense therapy. Their single or ayahuasca experiences were sort of the thing that transformed them. And we're trying to see what that looks like in a research context. And so it's exciting that he established this chair, but even Yale University says it can take 2 years for FDA regulatory approval for any kind of a psychedelic research training study. So I'm trying to learn about what we can do at USC. We have a gerontology school. There's a lot of interest in thinking about psychedelics and aging or dying. We have potential donors, but I don't understand the regulatory framework enough to think about how we can build a path forward at a time when our students are asking us to do so. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Varun. I want to pull on a thread from your discussion. This idea of a spiritual health crisis really sticks out from what you said. And in the media, we often hear psychedelics being framed as medical treatments. And I wonder, I pose this to all of the panelists, to what extent should the spiritual implications, the spiritual use of psychedelics be better foregrounded in the discussion at state and federal levels? And I think this ties in also a little bit with what you said, Jamie, about potentially a duty or an obligation of the church to become more literate with this subject matter. So I'll just pose that to anyone who might like to respond.
I would say part of what I talk about with students is that spiritual health is mental health. Spiritual health has historically been mental health. Shamanic traditions, psychedelic use, chaplaincy, gurus, that was mental health for thousands of years. And so, as we have sort of disaggregated psychiatry and spirituality, or over the last 100 years, there's been a lot of tension between the two. That's not the way I was raised to look at that from a Hindu, Buddhist, or Indian perspective. The early ideas of consciousness and models of the mind in our tradition are Hindu and Buddhist perspectives or models. And so I talk about it from a spiritual health perspective now because I'm the dean of religious life, and I believe that we are spiritual beings having a human experience as opposed to human beings having a spiritual experience. That's my point of view. But I also want to foreshadow or foreground meaning-making, community building, the sense of being part of a larger whole, an ethical way of being in the world, a song or story to live by, a sacred text that moves you. Even if you're not religious, you can have something sacred in your life as a protective factor. I really want to socialize those concepts to students who might just be thinking about it as a mental health crisis. But from my perspective, they're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I can jump in too. So along with my research on the laws in psychedelic churches, which I presented on earlier, I've been exploring the question of spiritual care in psychedelic medicine and specifically psychedelic chaplaincy, some of the law side of that, but also some of the ethical questions related to spiritual care in psychedelic medicine. And I presented this work in the Netherlands at some conferences with Petrie-Flom. And I always pose this question, which I don't know the answer. Like, are psychedelics medicines with spiritual side effects or spiritual aids with medical benefits, right? Like, is the spiritual experience, the CERT experience that Jamie mentioned, which the great team at Emory have kind of coined this term for the spiritual, existential, religious, or theological aspects of these experiences, like, is that the core medical benefit? Or is it just some like spiritual side effect, which I think the medical literature around psychedelics has debated to what extent we should embrace this spiritual aspect of these medicines. And though there is evidence that people who have more intense spiritual experiences have increased efficacy of the medical benefits of their psychedelic use, I actually don't even need to answer that question of like whether the spiritual aspects are the benefit or not. Like, to me, the fact that we're even talking about these spiritual aspects means that we need to embrace them. And we need and embracing them is both ethically necessary and medically beneficial. And I'll make a pitch for the Petrie-Flom annual conference last year, was on psychedelic law and medicine, and I have a chapter on chaplaincy. So sign up for those newsletters that got dropped in the chat earlier, and you can find out when that book is out. There was a lot of terrific presentations. But on this like spiritual care answer, I mean, to me, I think we need to have spiritual care as part of psychedelic medicine and psychedelic therapy at every level, the state level, the more explicitly medical model, and then of course in the religious freedom context. And that's drives my work with Pulse.
Clearly drives my work as well, since my context, and the answer is absolutely for me. And like Farin, I actually work on a college campus. I don't work with undergraduates, but I have seminary students who, by the way, right, are already accessing ketamine therapy. And how shall I say this politely? I'm a little underwhelmed about the kind of meaning making and integration or lack of involved in that. So what's happening is my students are this bifurcation is not helpful, let's say, at the very least. And so what it entails is then they're coming into my office to talk about, okay, how do I put this into the context of my religious tradition? Because if you come from any kind of religious tradition, you understand that there is no healing unless there's integration between the medical and the spiritual, because as you said, they're the same thing. I mean, I'm Christian, and so the main figure in my tradition is Jesus, who of course is known across all the texts as a healer, right? Is a spiritual leader. And we could talk about what ancient demon possession is in today's, DSM diagnoses or whatever, but it's baked into the tradition itself. And so if physicians think that at least people who are coming from certain religious traditions are going to gain ultimate long-lasting healing without attention to and taking seriously, not dismissing, not belittling the spiritual side of their experience, then I think that's unfortunate. So I'll stop there, but I'm obviously incredibly passionate about foregrounding the spiritual. Yeah.
Can I say a little bit, Mason, as well in response?
Absolutely.
So because most of my work is in the context of India, and there isn't a buffer between spirituality and psychiatry there in the way in which you find it here, right? To the point that I would say most people still, like I think 85% of people, when they have something resembling a psychological ailment, they go to a shrine or a temple first, and then they're referred to professional psychiatrists. There's a huge dearth of the latter sort of just professional psychiatrists who are working in India. So my sense is that, I come from a slightly cautionary stance on whether we can incorporate spirituality without first having some consensus on what it means. Only because I know that basic assessment, even in the context of India, is very, very hard, which is for me, it's not clear what am I measuring when I am, or what am I, like, besides just verbal self-reports, what am I measuring if I'm measuring something like a spiritual commitment? So in that sense, for me, like generations after generations of psychiatrists in India have complained basically about the kind of dependency relationships that patients have, or the preference for overt situational support, or the fact that they are willing to dissolve their ego and completely accept the psychiatrist as if they were a guru. In psychedelic sciences here, those are all like cautionary things, like the guru effect. You don't want to be imposing a view on the patient. You don't want to suggest things that might make or lead them in directions that they might not want to go towards. So I do think that I'm very empathetic to the project, but I think there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done in order to just understand what are we talking about when we talk about spirituality. This does not mean that there has to be a clinical perspective on that idea, which I think is often the case, but I do think that it has to be somewhat robust in like for the purposes of public presentation.
This idea of defining terms kind of leads into a question we have from Ben Bregman, who asks, there seems to be a conflation of the concepts of medicine and healing. Is there value in redefining these words in a way that disentangles their meaning as an early step in creating space for psychedelics to exist as a, quote, healing practice? And then I would add to that, can these things be disentangled? I mean, it sounds as though in some contexts, perhaps they cannot. What are your thoughts there? And then I also want to, since we're running low on time, I want to bundle that with another question. You can answer either. We actually have a group of students with the Harvard Student Health Law Society watching. So shout out to the Health Law Society. And they ask, what role could the law play in addressing this meaning crisis, which is a very challenging and intelligent question. So thank you for that.
I'll jump in on the medicine healing question. I mean, the question of what role the law can play in helping is like the question. So good on you for asking it. And I wish I had all the answers. But on the medicine and healing issue, I think specifically in the religious freedom context, it's really tough because when you say medicine or you make health claims, you're like triggering the FDA, antenna of like, oh no, they're doing something that we save for FDA approved drugs, right? And we've seen in terms of how courts have treated psychedelic churches, that if you're making health claims or referring to your practice as like healing or medicine, that might take away, although it should not, from how courts might view your religious sincerity. So I think that is just like a challenge right now, where the law can't capture the fact that religion is healing. Even though mainstream established religions pray for healing and chaplains are in hospitals, it just feels like the legal system around psychedelics can't wrap its arms around medicine and healing and spiritual use. And so that's just an ongoing challenge. Yeah, I'll let someone else take a stab at it.
Yeah, I think maybe I can say a little bit just to add to Victoria's point. It's I do think that there is, and I'm thinking of Jerome Frank's book Persuasion and Healing, and from which he derived that the core factors of psychotherapy are very similar to psychiatric practice and to healing practices, and those account for a lot of the effect that happens as part of psychotherapy. I I will still say that it might be helpful again to see what are the common features and where those features don't dovetail. Um, I they are aggregate categories, healing and things like that, and I think they should be disaggregated into their constituent components, and then see which ones should we borrow, which ones we shouldn't borrow, which ones should be used to create a common model of psychedelic integration, etc.
Yeah, I love the question. I love both of the questions that were posed. And Varun, were you getting ready? Actually, I should let Varun go. You had. So I think this is wonderful, and what it's kind of bringing up for me as well. So I work in the area also of disability studies, and this whole conversation about what counts as cure versus healing. I think also somehow plays into this conversation. So, of course, the medical profession, rightly so, is is concerned with cure, which is the elimination of a particular medical impairment. And I think there's overlap with, say, spiritual categories of healing, wherein a medical impairment is not necessarily resolved, but the person is considered healed because, for instance, perhaps their perspective towards the impairment has been changed. They are integrated into a community that helps them make meaning of whatever the medical impairment may be that is not curable. So just to kind of not answer, but maybe to complexify the conversation a little bit more, I would want to throw in the language of cure and healing and be clear about those and how they function in the medical and spiritual realms.
I love both those questions, and I probably can't answer either of them. But from the legal perspective, I think just this federal classification of Schedule 1 is the death knell of research or industry for us. I mean, I can't believe that cannabis is still a Schedule 1, meaning no medical benefit. And since 1996, doctors have been prescribing cannabis for medical ailments. And so I understand like a patchwork approach that's decentralized on states is probably what even got us to a decriminalization era of cannabis. And yet without any federal guidelines, regulations, it's not you can't bank, you can't research, I'm trying to run a psychedelic study with the dean of the gerontology school, the director of the Norris Cancer Research, and an incredibly well-known and highly acclaimed psychiatrist at USC. So we have 2 deans and a director of the cancer center, and we can't get FDA approval to do mindfulness and psilocybin for post-chemotherapy recovery. And so even when you have the political will, the donor base, the zeitgeist transformation, the young people wanting to enter new fields, and essentially a consensus of right-left, like the people who are pushing against the Schedule 1 classification of cannabis psychedelics are not right or left per se. They're across the political spectrum. Actually, there are people who are really invested in PTSD for vets in the military space who are pushing for this, who might be more libertarian. And then there are people who might be more progressive or even socialists who are also pushing it for different reasons. So it's a unique political coalition. And despite all this, we're still in a world where not just psychedelics, but cannabis is still Scheduled 1 federal from the federal perspective. And until we change that legally, we're just kind of chasing our tails with a whack-a-mole approach to trying to do whatever we can between the spaces and within the loopholes.
Believe it or not, we've used up all our time. I think we've demonstrated that we've really only scratched the surface and perhaps raised more interesting questions than we've answered. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we will be investigating these questions all year. I apologize if we did not make it to your question. I appreciate everyone's contributions, and I want to thank our panelists for being here today and being a part of the Pulse project. I also want to thank the Petrie-Flom Center staff, Laura Chong and Lisa Gorolik, for making this event possible, as well as Susanna Baruch, the executive director of the Petrie-Flom Center. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Please do sign up for the newsletters and keep an eye out for upcoming psychedelic public-facing events and research from Harvard University, the Law School, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and the Divinity School. Thank you so much, and have a great afternoon.